What is a CBO? And why is it such a big freaking deal that the FPV Freedom Coalition and the Flight Test Community Association have just been recognized as a CBO by the FAA? That's going to be the topic of today's video. There are two things that a CBO does that I think are most interesting in this conversation. But we're going to be talking with my guests, Josh Bixler from the Flight Test Community Association and Dave Messina from the FPV Freedom Coalition about their perspective on this. And the two things that a CBO does are, number one, they write safety rules. And those safety rules are submitted to the FAA, and then the FAA says, yes, we approve. And then individual pilots can look at the safety rules put out by a CBO and say, I am flying under these safety rules. And this is a big deal because until recently, the only organization that pretty much everybody assumed was going to be a CBO was the AMA. And the AMA mostly represents fixed-wing pilots flying at traditional flying sites. And that's not really compatible. The safety rules that they write are in many ways not ideal for FPV pilots flying at their house or at a park. The FPV Freedom Coalition and Flight Test Community Association being recognized as CBOs means that pilots who don't want to fly under the AMA safety rules don't have to just be breaking the rules in order to do the kind of things that we have always done. We can now point to these rules and say, I'm following these rules instead of these rules, instead of just, I'm breaking the rules. The other huge thing that a CBO can do is submit applications for FRIA, an FAA-recognized identification area. And a FRIA is a big deal because a FRIA is a fixed site where you can fly without being required to have remote ID on your aircraft. And if FRIAs were only traditional AMA-style flying fields, then FPV pilots would just be legally required to have remote ID on their aircraft pretty much everywhere they went. But if you could define your yard as a FRIA, your school football field as a FRIA, your local park as a FRIA, if you could define anywhere you normally wanted to fly as a FRIA, that would really make it easier for people who wanted to fly without remote ID but didn't want to break the rules. With the FPV Freedom Coalition and the Flight Test Community Association as CBOs, there are now two organizations who have committed to try to get the kind of places that we always fly that aren't traditional flying fields to submit those applications and try to get those approved as FRIAs. In fact, it's not in this video, but I have already submitted the application to have my house turned into a FRIA through the FPV Freedom Coalition.
It's far more than remote ID. It was the trust test. It was FRIAs. It was CBO recognition, and it was also remote ID. All those are a big picture. It wasn't just about remote ID. And the reason why it's really important for people to know that was because we need to answer solutions to all of it. Not just because if it's all about remote ID, then FRIA is like the afterthought, when really the way it was supposed to originally roll out was, CBOs were recognized, a standardized test for people that was a basic knowledge-based test was supposed to be rolled out. Then FRIA creation was to be done through the CBOs. That gives people the ability to fly freely, to be able to not have to worry about any additional hardware, any cost burden. And then ultimately, if those couldn't be met, you're still required to fly under a elected CBO's guidelines, safety guidelines, but then you have to put on a broadcast module or have standard remote ID.
So you're a CBO. Who cares? What does that net you? What does that net people who are interested in that? And I researched this as I was writing our press release, and it goes back to the statute that the CBO now is, the FAA is required to go to the CBOs on topics of structure and flight regulations for recreational, and what the CBO is supposed to be the organization that approves FRIAs. So those are two benefits to people flying recreationally of, why do I care that these guys are CBOs? And so we're a voice on regulations, and we're also day-to-day operations and educating on safety and STEM, but also providing background or approval for FRIAs.
And it's a big deal. So I think what you're saying, Dave, is it's a big deal because the structure that the FAA has created is that these CBOs sort of form an umbrella, and the FAA has to go through them in order to accomplish certain things. And hobbyists who want to fly can sort of get under that umbrella and operate in certain ways that they couldn't if they were not under that umbrella.
Yeah. And in the other direction, requirements have to flow from the community through us into the FAA. And what's great is the FAA has to listen.
Do they though? Well, at least they're supposed to.
Yeah, it comes down to individuals, and we've got a number of fans, and we have a couple of detractors. So it's like any organization.
This is pretty exciting because Dave, with your focus on FPV, the FPV Freedom Coalition, and Josh with the Flight Test Community Association's focus on, it actually makes me wonder, Josh, what's the difference between what you guys are doing in terms of your rules and regulations versus what the AMA does? Because you guys do similar types of flying.
Yeah, that's a great question. Basically, our main focus with the FTCA and also flight tests in general is getting people into the hobby. That's not going to be with big turbine jets. That's not going to be with 700 class helis or pylon racers. We're not really competition heavy. What we are activity heavy, experience heavy. Exactly what Dave's holding up right there. That actually is the poster child. That plane he's holding up is, I teach kids as young as 5 years old how to fly. So the planes that we design, the planes that we teach off of, the planes that we educate people around is very heavy in DIY, very heavy in entry level. They're lighter, they're slower. They're basically what we call park flyers. So it's not just, I'm going to buy an airplane. I'm going to go to a club field. I'm going to pay my dues to join that club. I'm going to carry an insurance policy and have an AMA membership, which then allows me to join that club. All those things are financial burdens, are logistical burdens. Flight Test really believes in where you want to fly. As long as it's a safe, open place that you can fly, you should be able to fly there.
What's the sort of relationship between people who want to fly legally, right? Because, of course, there's always going to be people out there who say, I don't care about all this. I'm just going to do what I'm going to do, and they're never going to catch me. If they catch me, I don't care. Those people probably aren't watching this video at this point. They've already tuned out. But for people who want to fly legally, what's the relationship that the FAA sees between the individual pilots and the CBO? Like, what are the responsibilities and expectations that flow sort of both directions?
The first is safety education. And so the FAA would say their single mandate is safety. And so we would say, I think we're doing pretty well on safety, have had no fatalities. So what are we talking about? And in our safety guidelines, we tried to major on things that had a lot of common sense and practical. Be safe. Don't be silly. Then there's beyond, part of safety is also, flying in authorized airspace. So education on the rules of the road. And back from the community, it's approval of FRIAs. And to me, that's a good start. Josh, from there?
Yeah, exactly what Dave, and our approach is, we call it friend on the field. Basically, when someone comes and they want to learn how to fly, we take a very similar path that what general aviation is. The safety culture is woven into the education. When you're building, the safety culture is about how not to get burned with a glue gun and how not to cut yourself with a razor blade and things like that. Once you get out to the field after you built that airplane, you're learning about how to check to make sure you're flying in the right location, how to make sure that the plane is pre-flighted properly, your prop isn't loose, your controls aren't backwards, your center of gravity is proper. And then it's the culture of how do you fly around other people, making sure you don't fly over top of each other. All those things are written into our safety guidelines, but they're also basically things that are organically taught as someone learns how to fly. It's not a bipolar mentality here. And even with the way David approaches it, it's woven into how you do things. And if you can engage people right off the bat with teaching that way, suddenly these safety guidelines aren't so absurd because they're practical.
I think what I'm hearing is that the FAA's stated goal is safety. And when the FAA sort of tries to enforce safety, they make these one-size-fits-all rules that may not really reflect what we're actually doing on the ground. Because we're a tiny, tiny niche, and the FAA is concerned about general aviation as much as they are about little RC planes. But that by sort of delegating some of that safety and education down to the CBO level, it lets people who are closer to the ground make those rules and argue for those rules. And then once those rules are sort of accepted, then it sort of gets us a little more flexibility and freedom to do the things that we want to do.
And also, absolutely agree. And so good examples of that are one of the recommendations for safety guidelines in the advisory circular 9157C was make sure that everyone can fly their aircraft proficiently line of sight before they start flying FPV. Yeah. Now, for people who have flown RC planes for decades, not a big deal, but that's maybe 2 or 3% of FPV folks are like, I do what? So,
right. I
would
fail that test.
Common sense is hover first on any new build and then put the goggles on, then go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would like to hear more concrete examples, if you guys have them, about because I think a lot of the work that you guys do is sort of behind the scenes, and people don't understand the things you're going to bat for and the difference that what does it matter? Are there more concrete examples of things you guys fought for and ultimately got in terms of, rights and things that we can do?
Well, one is we're still in process, and so as they would say in Texas, we're fixing to get there, and that's shielded operations. Mm-hmm. And so shielded operations from a common sense perspective, as well as the perspective in New Zealand, is if you fly below a natural structure or man-made structure, below the top of that, you should be fine. And within some reasonable lateral distance of that structure. And so we first got that, we FPVFC got that integrated into a DAC tasking group, so a Drone Advisory Committee tasking group back in 2021. It then is throughout the Beyond Visual Line of Sight Aviation Rulemaking Committee, and we know that there are good discussions about shielded operations in the FAA, and the FAA further let a grant of $323,000 across 5 universities to study the veracity of shielded operations. So that's an example of something that is really common sense. It helps a ton, and it's not there yet, but that's something to help. One aspect that we did have a significant influence that did result in some benefit was the UAS facility maps. And so they used to be a 1 degree by 1 degree, which is about a mile square. Then we halved that. So one square now equals 4 squares. That's a big deal. And we can think about it from like tessellation. I can create a circle with quarters in a lot better than I can. So it allowed a much more granular review. Plus, we instituted a whole bunch of efforts on rework of the UAS facility maps, things like check next to the runway, because no one flies next to a runway. They fly off the ends of a runway. So good common sense, lots of different organizations working on that effort. And we were definitely an important part of that.
We are not one size fits all. And we certainly do not want to have rules beyond what's required, but what was quickly kind of happening, which required also very constant communication from both FTCA and FPVFC, was saying, hey, we got to educate you guys on how we need to represent the community, but we do not want to we ultimately don't want to end up with the same safety regulations as the AMA, which is, I'm not going to give you the exact number. It's say 28 pages, 30 pages, and ours is 10. Ours should be 10, because guess what? Our activity only represents what should be 10. So there's lots of communication, lots of education, and to the credit of the FAA, they listened to us. And that was a really good thing to get that CBO recognition.
Now, there's another topic that I think, I'm not sure exactly how you guys want to approach it, but it has to do with the FAA trying to sort of bypass the normal rulemaking process. And the general version of it that I heard was that the rulemaking, so there's a rulemaking process. They have to, it's for all federal rules. They have to submit it for comments, and there's like a comment period where the public can comment, and then they have to read the comments and respond to them. And they're not just allowed to make rules arbitrarily. Well, a lot of people feel like they do that, but there's a process. And when they started recognizing CBOs, one of the requirements was that the CBO had to have a safety plan. And I heard some suggestion that they were basically trying to pass specific safety rules by just not approving CBOs that didn't have the exact safety rules that they wanted. Is that right?
So we have 3 CBOs approved right now. We know that there are 5 more in the works. We've reached out. We don't know who they are. And so this can be very telling to see if there is a broad spectrum of safety guidelines across the 8 CBOs that finally get approved. In the statute, so in the Congress told the FAA, so this is law, and a recreational operator has to follow these guidelines. One of the things, as you just said, one of the things that they stipulated was you must comply with safety guidelines. So then the FAA with AC 9157C went way overboard on all of these different recommended guidelines, which the moment we put it into a CBO safety guidelines, it goes from recommended to required. And they just went around the rulemaking, the NPRM, the whole public comment process. So, we've cried foul. We've spoken to the FAA about this. Right now, we know that the FAA, does not make a lot of changes. Right, remote ID hasn't changed since the final rule. We don't expect the advisory circular 9157C to change, but we're hopeful that we can see some fewer rules, quote rules, constituted in the various CBO safety guidelines. And so we'll see evidence of this as we see the difference in the various safety guidelines. Well, a good example of this is night flying.
Okay.
Right? Night flying does not exist in the FPVFC safety guidelines. Now,
what does that mean? Doesn't exist?
We didn't write it. We didn't ask for it. We didn't write it.
So a person flying under the FPVFC safety guidelines wouldn't be able to fly at night.
Actually, they would, because if it's not stated, you can.
Oh, whereas the FAA recommended that you have rules for flying at night, which means that
lots of things. Yeah, so they recommended not only the restrictions were a anti-collision light of 3 statute miles, plus lights that indicate direction and vector, or position and vector, or orientation and vector.
Orientation, altitude, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, our response to that was, so we drafted a whole piece of it had we been asked about it so that we could have an appropriate response. We were never asked about it, so we did not include it. So we'll see over time if we are asked to include that. If we are, then, to your point, we'll see an issue with the point of one size does not fit all. And the one size does not fit all is an FAA agreed to position on safety. So we will be working that issue if it comes up that way.
Well, that's exciting. I first heard this story and thought, if all of the CBOs are required to have the same recommended to have the same 28-page safety guidelines as the AMA, then what do we really have? For those of us who would like to comply with the law, what do we really have? Nothing. But if organizations like FPVFC and Flight Test Community Association are being recognized as CBOs, then that hopefully indicates that there will be sort of this individual voice for these different types of flying situations where we will actually have some influence and actually have sort of a voice in the room. Let's talk about FRIAs and remote ID.
Sure.
Okay? Remote ID, in short, means that to fly your aircraft, you have to broadcast your certain information, including the position of the aircraft. And it means that people who build their own aircraft are going to have to put a little transponder on, which may cost as much as $200 and will add weight, especially for very small foamy aircraft, Josh. It would be very difficult. People don't like this. The alternative, one of the alternatives is to fly at a FRIA, recognized, what does this FRIA stand for?
FAA Recognized Identification Area.
And that means that you don't have to do that,
right?
But only a CBO can designate what is and isn't a FRIA.
With the FAA approval.
With the FAA's approval. Yeah. And so this means that you guys can now start designating FRIAs? Yes.
And that was for us specifically one of the biggest things that was the most kept us awake at night the most. We don't want people to have a financial burden. I mean, we just show them how to build an airplane for under $20. Yet you're talking about the need for remote ID. FRIAs are incredibly important to flight tests and the FTCA because that gives people the ability to build amateur-built aircraft, fly it freely without putting any extra equipment on. That's something that we really want to, put 110% into now that we're a CBO is giving someone, if they're in their backyard, they fly with their friends and family, we want them to be able to put a FRIA in their backyard so they don't have any extra burden. Incredibly important for us.
Whoa, hang on. When you say the word FRIA, mm-hmm. I'm thinking, obviously, like your flight park is going to be a FRIA, flight field, a FRIA in your backyard.
Yeah.
Is that for real?
Do you fly in your backyard?
Yeah. No. Wait, no. It's still legal. Yeah. No, I'm not. I'm Class G, but I don't want to admit. No, I do. Obviously, I do. Everybody does.
So here's the reality: is we want people to be able to do exactly what they were doing tomorrow as they were yesterday. And if that's flying in your backyard with your friends and family, that's what we want to see. That is why I believe that the FPVFC and FTCA represent the overwhelming majority of hobbyists and also the up and coming hobbyists, young kids, young adults, people in schools, STEM programs, et cetera, is because they need to be able to fly right where they are. The notion of go into a club, joining a club, drive into the club, that is very old and outdated for many, many people. And I'm not saying that it's not for everybody, but if you're flying yesterday in your backyard and it meets the requirements to be able to make a FRIA, I believe both entities want to help make that FRIA happen.
Well, and I think you guys are going to be overwhelmed with requests.
That's what we anticipate. And the way that Josh has positioned this is, in my view, brilliant and very important. So let's try to establish a FRIA. And if we absolutely cannot do that, okay, then remote ID.
Yeah. And with that said, Dave, it is safe to say flight tests will have a remote ID solution that will meet the requirements and that people will be able to use. And the best part is it's designed in the U.S. and it's made in the U.S. So we're going to be able to provide that solution. If you can't get a FRIA or you want to be able to be transient and go fly at different places, we'll have a remote ID solution for you.
Yeah, well, I think if anybody can come up with a remote ID solution that meets the needs of our type of RC hobbyist, then it's Flight Test. Yeah.
Thank you, brother.
So that's exciting.
That's incredibly kind of you to say that. Thank you.
Yeah, well,
there are a couple of stipulations on the FRIA that are really important, and this is part of the will we be overwhelmed or not. One of the stipulations is you have to have access in some way to the fixed site that you're submitting as a FRIA, and so either you own it or you've got permission to fly there. So it can't be like a bando or a construction site. Exactly, and it's if it's a park. Then you have to get the permission probably of the municipality. Right. The park would have to apply to be a FRIA. The other thing that I mentioned was fixed site is a temporal aspect of this. So is it permanent? So for events, we've been whining to the FAA for years now about you have to be able to support us for FPV racing, and the racing sites stand up and get shut down. So what they did is they put a proviso in that we can submit with 90 days before the event, and it's like that doesn't work. I mean, if we can get Lance approval, automatically, what's the issue? If it's granted, if there's any question on ownership of the property, fine, just no, that should be just a kick out. But, if it's cut and dry, a good example is Edgewater. This is the property that Josh has for Flight Test, and they've already had races there. So wouldn't it be great to say, this Friday, on Saturday, we've got a race coming up. Great. We want it to be a FRIA so that we don't have to add remote ID broadcast modules to the racers. Great. Yeah. And it's to us very sensible. Right, you're going to fly in this tiny 3-dimensional parallel biped.
I like the perspective that you guys are expressing because even for people who say, I don't care about this, I don't care about complying with the law, I'm just going to do my thing, they are going to benefit from the work that you guys are doing because your goal is to make the things we already do, to make as many of the things we already do legal,
Right.
or compliant with regulation. And so people who do those things anyway, fewer of them are going to be in violation. Whether it matters or not, of course, remains to be seen. I really like that approach.
Yeah, try to make it frictionless. Try to make it understandable and approachable for kids so that they can comply.
Well, and hopefully a lot of there have been some voices who've said this remote ID thing, this regulation, it's too much. I'm out. And hopefully, that message can change to be more like you can do the things you want to do.
Right. And if it's recreational, it's one broadcast module across all of your aircraft. Those of us who fly recreationally have a couple more than one or two model aircraft.
They breed like rabbits.
Yep.
We got 10,000 plus kids right now doing FT STEM. Imagine all of a sudden comes along the burden that every one of those students has to have their own remote ID solution. That's terrifying. That's just going to kill everything. And of course, people have the right to say, I will not comply, but we owe it to them to give them a path to be compliant, to do it safely, and to do it as economically and easy as possible.
Yeah, non-compliance is in some ways the last resort. I don't. Maybe not everybody would agree with that. Some people would say, well, non-compliance with something I think to be immoral or wrong is the first choice. I guess I respect that, but a lot of people would say, look, if I can comply without putting myself out, I will. And it's the only problem. The real problem here is that the rules being imposed are so unrealistic and draconian and prohibit so many of the things that we have done safely for so long that I don't respect the rules.
That's beautifully said.
Yeah.
It's not, practical. We know what's practical and what's not. I mean, how many people, Dave, race beyond a 4-cell battery? You know where I'm going with this?
Yep.
Practical rules for the activity that you're doing is incredibly important. And it's not practical to be able to tell someone when they're building a $20 foam airplane that you need to put technology on that's going to be, broadcasting your location. It's far more practical to tell them, hey, here's how we can put FRIAs all over the place. And I do believe that's where the FTCA kind of stands apart from the AMA, where I think their number one goal is really to establish where their club sites are, where we don't care where you are. If you can legally put a FRIA in your backyard, if you can legally put a FRIA at where you fly currently, whether you own it or you have permission from the owner, we want to help you get there. And my hope is that there's thousands and thousands of FRIAs all over the country. And then when a quad race comes, we already work great with FPVFC. We can work together to make sure that those locations can be flexed to serve both communities really well.
Well, I've joked ever since FRIAs were first mentioned. I've joked, maybe I can use my position as a big influencer in the world of FPV to get my house declared a FRIA. And then what about all the little people? Well, it turns out it looks like it hopefully will be for as many of the little people as possible.
If you draw breath and you love flight, we need to serve you. That's at the end of the day. There's no little people or big people. I know you're having fun with that, but that should be the stance of the FAA. It's definitely the stance of the two CBOs that you're talking to right now. There is no us and them. There's people that love flight that want to use it as a tool to better people's lives than their own, and that needs to be served. That vision needs to be served. And trust me, in this time and day when there's going to be 640,000 jobs that being met. They need to get out of the way and let us do our job. Yeah, and I believe that they're finally doing so.
Amazing. That's a great sentiment. So do you guys, is it too early yet to point people to a web page where they can submit their address and have you guys start processing paperwork to turn them into by the way, have to point out, individuals do not need to comply with remote ID until September 2023.
Correct.
So in fact, if your house isn't a FRIA, you can still fly there without remote ID with a self-built drone, just to be clear.
Yep.
But you may as well get the ball rolling, right?
Yes. And yes, there is. And so we, if you search on FAA CBO, you can find the site and the dashboard, and we can get you a link where you can submit a request to be a FRIA. Interestingly, the website, the way it's working right now, is you can request a FRIA for a fixed location, not an event, if you are a recreational flyer. You do not have to be a CBO, and part of the application is you must stipulate which CBO's guidelines you're going to use.
Okay.
What we are talking to the FAA and asking the question, we thought that you were going to funnel this through us. What if a recreational flyer submits an application directly to the FAA? What part of the process would you like us to take? So that's an unknown, and so this is part of the startup, and so it would not surprise us if it changes and all submissions have to go through us, and that's what we anticipated.
How do you guys want to wrap this up? We've been going for about an hour. I don't want to take too much of your time. What kind of a note do we want to go out on? Josh?
My opinion would be that this is not we got there, yay, but this is actually the foundation that we now get to build on. So in my opinion, it's yay, we are now CBOs. We get to start doing the work that we are passionate about doing. And our first line of defense is establishing, for me, is FRIAs. And then as we get FRIAs established and stuff, obviously we're going to be making sure remote ID and those kind of things are answered in a way that is not going to impact the community and the hobby too badly.
Dave?
And I would add that with all of the regulation GORP that we've been talking about, we're grounded in common sense. I built this and flew it on Saturday. Yes, it did fly.
Looks awesome.
Beautifully. And I had a minor role in this that flies just under 100 miles an hour. And the design of it is available on Park Flyer International for free. And so I helped design and build and fly and have been doing it for 4 decades. So all of the FPVFC core team fly, build, and we are steeped in common sense. And that's what we're trying to do, is create frictionless abilities. Or as Josh put it, we want you to be able to do what you're doing yesterday, tomorrow as well.
And I appreciate the work that you guys are doing. I hear stories that boil down to, this is a huge bureaucratic process with so many moving parts. And, it's one thing to go stand outside the FAA's headquarters and picket, which is a very big, visible thing. It's one thing to, file a lawsuit, which is visible and has some effect. But there is a much less glamorous sort of making of the sausage that happens. And I hear people sometimes say, what are these guys doing for us? And I think from my perspective, you guys are there sort of in that bureaucratic mess, sitting in meetings, taking phone calls, making phone calls, finding people, arguing, and just playing that game. And it's nice to see some recognition of that by having you both be recognized as a CBO and now sort of having an official position to start sort of shaping this in a more direct way. So thank you guys for the work that you do. I'm going to put links to both of your websites. People can join, people can donate, and I'm sure that's very much appreciated. Dave Messina, Josh Bixler, thank you so much.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you.